event is to come together, to make connections between different fields and to learn from one another about the challenges of producing knowledge about controversial subjects.
What I want to talk about in the time I've got is to talk a little bit about the New Zealand context, but focus particularly on conflicts of interest and with regard to research in gambling. We don't have a problem with gambling, we have a problem with the consumption of profits from gambling. One is that obviously the manufacturers, distributors, the industry itself. One is government. Another one is the community sector. For us, that's huge. And finally is helpers and researchers. And I think that researchers have a very important role here in terms of that they generate knowledge. Not only do they generate knowledge, but they are instrumental in choosing the gaze, what we choose to research, where we actually start to look at what matters. And it's that I think has been most threatened by often most threatened by these relationships. Now, I think there's several ways in which researchers receive funding from the industry. One is blatant acceptance straight from a casino or from a poker trust. Where in our neck of the woods, that's becoming less obvious or less frequently occurring. What tends to happen is that money is channeled through what I'd call ethical sanitising practices. So there's strategies to try and water down the extent or the obviousness of the relationship that's going on. So I guess the tension between desires and values often afflict us all, I think, in various ways.
I wondered what you thought the likely impact of university pressures towards both external grant funding and public engagement or impact would have on this entire realm.
Academics are now assessed on grant and publication. It's become a lot more intense. And so the temptation of this funding has also increased enormously, I think.
Is the problem not so much that the money's coming from the industry, but the arrangement between the industry and the commissioning body is a voluntary one? So therefore the industry feels it has more leverage with over here it's the Responsible Gambling Trust to perhaps dictate the terms and parameters of research that's commissioned. Whereas if it was a statutory levy that was given to the Gambling Commission, as was intended in the Gambling Act, then perhaps there would be produce more objective research and perhaps the levy would be somewhat larger than the 0.1% that they pay at the moment.
You're linking the supply to the consumption, aren't you? So the money available is linked to the consumption. So there's a relationship there that's not good for the long term, but also the perception under even a statutory levy is that the money belongs, the industry is providing it. It's our good work that's provided it, so we should have a say. So once the industry has a say, the research agenda gets just for the reasons that was talked about before, that gets diverted, I would argue.
I can understand what you're saying. You're saying gambling money is tainted, therefore don't use it for research. If we look pre-legalisation of gambling in the UK, the only research which was done by the anti-gambling groups, the Churches Council on Gambling, and this was criticised for being overtly biased. What you're saying is gambling money is tainted, don't use it to fund research. Who then pays for the research?
I mean, I think fundamentally if it was as Matt describes, if it was precisely that, then I think one should be very, very concerned. I have to say, of course, these things inevitably are personal, aren't they? Because they are what you spend your time doing. I should not wish to be in a situation of running a charity regulated by the Charity Commission. If we were simply in a situation where money was received from an industry and that industry then directed how that money was to be spent. That is not the situation we're in, and it's not a situation I wish to be in, and I don't think it's a situation the Charity Commission would allow us to be in. I have spent the last 3 months working very hard at trying to keep the government and the regulator at arm's length from the research programme that we have commissioned of independent researchers. We don't carry out research. I spend all my time endeavouring to keep the industry at arm's length And it is absolutely key to keep all interested parties at arm's length. From our point of view, we actually, at the outset, in setting up the Responsible Gambling Trust, has said, well, actually it seems to me that the regulator or government ought to be responsible for research. We were more than happy to focus on education, prevention and treatment. It was in fact the regulator that said, no, actually we think that that best sits with your organisation, and that's how we proceed.
I think we're all quite aware of the increasing emphasis on evidence and evidence to guide social policy more broadly. So what I'd like to do is kind of to really say, well, what do we need to understand and look at if we want to move beyond this language of evidence-based policy and doing what works? So I'll start by just raising a few issues with this. And I'll start by saying I think we all recognize evidence is important. I don't think anybody would say that you want to act against evidence. So if you want to achieve a goal, you want to know if you're getting to that goal effectively, and evidence will tell you that. But one of the challenges, I think, is that these calls for what works and these calls for evidence-based policy tend to remove political debate and this critical issue of values, which is what I'll focus on mostly today. They remove that from the equation, as if in some ways values are antithetical to evidence. We typically focus on pieces of evidence. We believe pieces of evidence. It's easier for us to see pieces of evidence that align with our existing views and values. It's much easier to not see and to ignore pieces of evidence that challenge us. We need to make our frames of reference and our value positions explicit. If we're ever going to make progress in these debates, we need to be recognizing that we're debating from a different value position. What I see as convincing evidence for me might be a reflection of the fact that it's measuring the things I care about and not measuring the things you care about. And that needs to be made explicit.
I think today, for me anyway, has come together really beautifully, and I hope what I'm going to say is going to build on the previous presentations. In 2011, we began work on GAMSOC, a project supported by the European Research Council, which sought to assess the value of an anthropological approach to gambling, an area which is more commonly understood through psychological or sociological perspectives. We were struck by the relative absence of critical reflection on the production of gambling research compared to other fields, including alcohol and tobacco. We decided to gather a variety of qualitative, lively data from a range of sources, participants in our fields, who are newcomers, old hands, and importantly, those who have chosen to leave the field. Rather than continuing to assert that there's a lack of high quality research in this field, as many literature reviews have done, we wanted to use the voices of researchers and research users to help you to understand how this field operates in practice. And we'll just show you, what did people say?
They are paranoid about research. They really don't like it.
The Daily Mail has had more impact on policy than any researcher or centre. Is this evidence-based policy? I think not. It's politics pure and simple.
Never known anything like the way that some of these gambling academics are in bed with the industry.
My idea of research is that it should emerge from the data in a kind of dance, and there is no dance in gambling research. It's robotic, idiotic, it's unresponsive, it's rigid. You should be doing research that's agile, something of beauty, something true.
Most of the senior researchers in the world have for quite some time been funded by the industry directly or indirectly, so the whole academy is very distorted. We've got a clean-up job to do.
It's important to understand that this is really quite a hard thing to study. Gambling is a multifaceted social, psychological thing, and there are a huge number of ways of looking at it and understanding it.
In the report, we haven't sought to resolve the tensions between various positions, but to preserve that sense of ambiguity, if you like, which I think we've heard about throughout today. We don't want to suggest that there's a single industry perspective on research or a single experience of conducting research. On the contrary, we learned that this experience was highly personal, very dependent on circumstances, on networks, and on serendipity.
I think a lot of these problems really come down to the same thing, and that is that we should, I think one of your quotes, somebody said, it should be cleaned up. The situation whereby money is raised for gambling research in this country and it's dispersed should be cleaned up. And I think that should be the first priority.
I've had people from the Gambling Commission say the situation we have at the moment is embarrassing. They won't say that, of course, on record. This is off the record. They say it's embarrassing, but at least it's the best we can get. I've talked to people today who've said, yes, but okay, you're right. It's not an ideal system, but but it's not bad. But really, from what everybody is saying, it is bad. And what your participants are saying, it is bad. And it should be cleaned up. And I think everybody who's involved in it should make that the first priority